Hi, welcome to the mini podcast series Women of the PCUSA. Join us as we ask the questions: was it equal? Is it equal? Will it ever be equal? Welcome back to the podcast, Women of the PCUSA. This is our 4th out of 5 episodes in this series, and I appreciate you for joining with us today. Today we are going to review a few of the survey studies sent out regarding the perception of women in ministry from both the public, multi-denominational view as well as PCUSA pastors. This survey was a volunteer-based survey sent out to around 35 individuals, in which we had 31 responses. I'm going to go through some of the questions and some of the answers that I found super intriguing, and we are going to review this together. One of the first questions I asked was, what was your denomination? We had a wide variety of answers, but 9 out of the 30 responses came from people who belonged to a non-denominational church, then followed by Presbyterian, in which there were 6. Then there were other denominations such as Baptist and Assemblies of God or Southern Baptist. Majority of the people who responded to this survey were female. We did have about 4 men respond to this survey, so just keep that in mind as I answer and explain some of the findings from this survey. A lot of the people's first encounter with female leadership within the church came from a position of a nursery caregiver, a Sunday school teacher, or a music director, or working with children most commonly. This is something that fits the stereotype of women in ministry. I personally have even gotten comments of, hey, I know you want to be a pastor, but you're talking about children's ministry, right? You want to be a children's pastor? When in reality, I absolutely do love children, but want to pursue preaching in the large church scale. So that's a fairly common occurrence, even as someone who isn't even in ministry yet. But just the idea of approaching it brings on those things. The attributes and qualities that women tend to demonstrate were overwhelmingly kind, nurturing, compassionate, attentive, quiet, generous, kind, and a lot of soft-spoken answers from many women. The men responded with descriptive words like bold and compassionate, and words that were the opposite of women, which I found interesting because it's not the expected answer. For the question of do the qualities stated in the previous response, being the question of what attributes do women display in church, change when they are not in the church building, and about a third of the people said yes, a little over a third said no, and another third said it depends or somewhat. And then when given the explanation, some of my favorite responses are, these qualities are strongest when physically in the church building but are not entirely absent otherwise. And I think that's true. And then another point is that oftentimes when women enter the church, they feel as though they have to perform or act in a certain way to be a quote-unquote good Christian woman. And I think that's important because in almost any space that we enter, we sometimes alter ourselves to fit the space that we are in and to be what people want us to be. And so that aspect of women in the church, not necessarily, but not also exclusively, to women in the pastoral positions having to change who they are. But as you'll hear in a little bit, the opinion on that question from other pastors is almost the opposite of that of the public, where they feel that they can bring the gifts and talents that they have in the world into their role in ministry. So when asked what roles do women have in the church, this is where there was a lot of discrepancies, which is expected because of the variety of denominations that we had responses from. However, Many of the answers include supporters of their husband, childcare, hospitality, being a children's church or a Sunday school director, a secretary, worship leader, anything like that. And then there were also answers like anything they want to be, LOL. So the variety in this is also very present. When asked, do you think men are accepting of women? The answer was a third no, and a little bit less than a third yes, and then the rest of it was it depends or sometimes. And then when asked the same question but about women accepting other women in leadership positions, 51% of the people said yes, which is the opposite of what Reverend Casey said in the last episode of our podcast, and it is not exactly what the women and men of the second survey that I sent out say either. When asked, are women and men treated equally within leadership positions of the church? Most of the people answered no, and then when asked what's the biggest challenge, misogyny and discrimination were the two biggest answers for what they can assume are the biggest conflicts, because most of these people, in fact all of these people, are not in the day-to-day of the shoes that women in ministry or people in ministry face, but they assume that the hardest thing was overcoming that challenge of not being male in a male-dominated field. The final question is that do you think gender plays a role in the authority in the church? And almost 90% of the people who responded said yes. And I think the answer that sums it up best is that gender plays a role in almost everything that we do. And it's hard to, even if we don't think that that's true in general, we have underlying biases that come out in moments like this. So this is what the public had to say. When speaking with the pastors, or not speaking with, but reading their responses, this was where it was also quite fascinating. There were 5 responses, 3 female and 2 male, all that which are pastors or influential people in the Presbyterian Church of the USA, or the PCUSA. And a lot of their first experiences of church members, of church leadership of women in the church happened with youth or as leaders in the church, but not as pastors in the pulpit. When asked what qualities they have, mothering, caring, nurturing, gentle, compassionate, tolerant, and love were the overwhelming answers. When the question was asked that do the previous response change when women are not in church, this answer was specifically eye-opening to me because it was very different than expected. 40% of the people said no, 40% said yes, and 1% did not feel comfortable answering the question, which I totally understand. You may at this point understand that many of the questions that I've asked as part of this survey were also questions that I asked Pastor Casey in our last episode, and I did this because I wanted to see the difference between the opinions of a person who lives out this life of being a woman in ministry every day and a person who attends church on Sunday or is involved with the inner workings of the church, however doesn't have that official role, so isn't subject to that direct inequalities that we are now realizing that most women in the PCUSA face. My biggest takeaway from this entire project, even though it was fairly small and very quick, was that the difference between public opinion on the struggles that female pastors face and real testimonies of struggles that women in ministry face, such as the hardest part about being a woman, right? This was very similar to hardest part about being a woman in ministry, balancing work and family life, or balancing unequal pay, or misogyny, which travels to many fields beyond just the field of ministry. So seeing that sometimes the root of this issue is not the structure of the PCUSA, and it's not something that the church is doing specifically, but it's honestly almost a universal struggle of a woman in the workplace. So seeing how those aspects travel into this of the church has been quite eye-opening, and the relationship in other aspects of the public opinion versus the real life testimonies and the discrepancies between the two, like the hardest parts between time and balancing work life and family life, or balancing or trying to achieve equality, what is required for that, and it's being more open-minded. That's true in all aspects of life. So that is a factor in this study that has been interesting to understand. I hope that you have learned something from this podcast. Stay tuned for our next and final episode coming soon. Thanks.